Hi guys, welcome to my channel DMaker. Today's video is the third part of the Do-It-Yourself table saw series. If you haven't seen the first two parts yet, I strongly recommend that you check those out before seeing this one. This video will be divided in 4 different steps. First, the electrical wiring, then the tabletop, the fence system, and the last step, which is a nice to have and a bit of a safety feature that you'll see in the end. Now enough talking and let's dive into the video. In order to wire the saw, I used the existing power cable, but I had to strip it down and connect an extension since it was not long enough for this table saw. I used each shrink sleeves in each of the wires and a larger one for the cable. The cable is then routed through a hole to the place where the switch will be mounted, which is on the left side of the table. To install the switch, I made a template out of a 4mm thick piece of plywood where I marked the holes for the switch. Two of the holes are for the back side of the switch and the other two are for the front panel screw. Then a big rectangle has to be removed in the center, and for that I used the jigsaw. It's time to connect all the cables, and for the cables that don't have any special connector, I use the terminal block connector, to which I'll leave a link in the description in case you want to know. After connecting everything, I turned on the saw and it seems to work fine. Let's move on to the tabletop. To fix the tabletop in place, I decided to use pocket holes, and the reason being is because I found it was the best compromise in being able to remove the top from maintenance and at the same time don't have any visible mounting hardware on the surface. I drilled pocket holes in pairs and made them in 5 different locations on each side of the table. Before assembling the tabletop in place, I drilled a hole on the bottom for connecting my shop vac, which will be my dust collection system for now. After fixing the tabletop, I used the saw itself to cut the groove in the top in order to have the exact location to install the zero clearance insert. For the insert, I used a 3mm thick piece of acrylic and marked its location so that the saw is easily accessible whenever I want to change the blades. I cut the hole using the jigsaw, but I protected its base with painter's tape to avoid scratching the top. As you can see, it's fairly easy to change or remove the blade. Using the router, I made a 3mm rebate so that the insert sits flush against the top. I rounded the corners of the acrylic to match the curve of the router bit. And then drilled 6 holes and countersink them to house the screws. To make the slot for the blade, I used the same technique as before, allowing the blade itself to make the cut, but this time in different angles. Now I just need to cut a longer slot by hand to be able to install a reading knife. Before making the fence itself, I cut a strip of 21mm Baltic birch plywood for the rail. I leave a 1mm gap from the side so that I can use it to stick a measuring tape. It's important to use a big amount of screws because this is where the fence will be making pressure against. For the main structure of the fence, I use the same 21mm melamine plywood as for the top, so that the fence is slippery on the sides, allowing the pieces to run smoothly. I check if the side of the fence is perpendicular to the top. This part is very important to make sure every cut is perfectly square. The fence runs smoothly and is perfectly square, so I can now assemble the tops using 18mm Baltic birch plywood. Now I install the rest of the pieces using screws, being careful not to overlap any screw. For the piece that will run against the rail, I used both wood glue and screws to make sure it has a tight bond. I install a spring together with a plastic foot in both sides so that the fence runs freely. I designed the handle previously, printed out the layout and then glued it to 18mm plywood using spray adhesive. Then it was cut to its rough shape using the bandsaw. I repeated the process in another piece of plywood and glued both together to make the handle thicker. While waiting for the glue to dry, I'll start making the cuts to install the handle. I didn't have any flexible sheet of metal available, so I used a cheap square to make the piece that will tie the fence against the table. For that, I need to make a groove using my improvised router table. I tested it and it seems to work fine. Now let's get back to the handle and sand it to its final shape using the disc sander. To allow the rotation of the handle, I use an 8mm stainless steel rod and cut it to size. I will use a bolt to make the fine adjustment of the fence perpendicularity. Because of the hole of the adjusting bolt, I will have to relocate these two screws. I use the drill bit to mark the exact location of the threaded insert. The bolt will be installed stuck between two pieces of plywood so that it won't move when rotating, moving only the piece with the threaded insert. Now I can adjust the fence so that it gets perfectly square with the blade. Going back to the handle, I use a round over bit in the router to make it more comfortable to the hand. I used a couple of wood shims to determine the exact location of the handle. And then I used the same shims to drill the holes for the shaft. After installing the handle, I check the squareness of the fence with the blade and it's perfectly acceptable. Now I can use more screws to fix this piece and install the springs in the back. Even though the fence is square, it might wobble a little bit at the end with bigger boards, so I decided to install a fixing knob at the end to use whenever it's necessary. With this extra holding, there is no wobbling at all and the fence will stay in its position during the entire cut. The only thing missing in this fence is a way to set the exact width of the cuts, and for that I start by using a piece of transparent plastic from an old box and cut it in a bandsaw. To fit the plastic piece, a slight groove has to be made using the router. I drill 2 holes and join them together so that I'm able to make fine adjustments in the position of the marker piece. Using an X-Acto knife and a brush pen, I mark a thin red line in the plastic piece. Then I glue a self-adhesive measuring tape in the rail. And this is the reason why I left a 1 mm gap between the rail and the tabletop border. It's time to make the final test. I set the fence to 10 cm, cut a piece of plywood and measure its width with a caliper. The result couldn't be better, it's spot on. I know the video is going long, so thanks a lot if you're still here. Finally, I just make a kind of a safety switch off system, making it easier to turn off the saw in an emergency. I made these holes off camera to make it easier to remove this part in the bandsaw. I thought of burning or carving the letters in the plywood, but I found that using a stencil it's much easier and the result is pretty okay. Now I can finally say I have a table saw and I'm quite happy with the way it turned out. The size of the table allows me to cut wider boards, and with this fence I can make perfectly square and precise cuts. Don't miss the last video of the series, where I will be showing you how to make the sleds, some useful accessories and improvements to the table saw. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that bell for notification. Thanks for watching, and remember, you can build it.